So Travis, when we were putting together Lead Together, we decided to include a chapter on diversity and inclusion. And it was a chapter I think we felt was really important. It also was one that was, we stepped into with caution. And it'd be interesting to hear your perspective on why you think including that chapter was important and why we thought it was really key to talking about a Lead Together organization.
Yeah, it was one that was hard. And like you said, we were thinking, what's our place in this conversation as all three white authors, Western educated? How do we have a voice in here? And that's why it seemed so important to say, we've got to think about everybody's experience, right? It just feels like a crucial thing to do. It also can unlock some interesting ideas because the diversity of perspective comes from people's lived experiences. Susan was talking about this wonderfully just in a session yesterday, where if you gather people and look at the business needs and the insights that are required to make your business, you'll naturally end up with a diverse set of people, right? I was actually working with a client that's in the pinball space, very male-dominated industry, traditionally, both from players and the people that work on it. And they made a concerted effort to grow a more diverse team along gender lines. And now they've got people that are leading female pinball leagues, and there's an entire segment of the market on, like, turns out women also like to play games and have fun. Who knew? And so by doing that, by elevating some other voices that had traditionally been minimized in that industry, there's a whole breadth of other ways that they can engage with each other. And it's early days in the journey, and there's still more work to go, which was another interesting piece of this, is finding companies that were proud of their diversity journey was really hard, because most people that start to get into it realize there's a lot farther to go. And part of this is kind of looking in the other mirror and realizing that there's bias everywhere. And so I'm curious, Susan, what are your thoughts on bias and meritocracy and how people use those words and how it shows up in organizations?
Well, meritocracy is clearly a vestige from orange organizations, right? The idea that everybody is equal from where they are currently, right? So if you have 5 people in a room that all went to the same university and had the same teachers and are now in an organization, that somehow that their experience is equal, and that's just patently not true. We talk a lot about our whole selves, right? And to imagine that we are just this narrow, thin slice of ourselves now based on our last experience or our last rung on the ladder is just in my mind, it's just foolish, right? We all have different and individual lived experiences that have been influenced by the predominant systems, lived experiences that have been influenced by racism, inequality, gender bias, all of these different things, and to imagine that isn't the case and that's not reality, I think is not only is it disingenuous, but it's dangerous. It's dangerous to our assumptions about what is possible from looking at organizing differently. And if we're not willing to go there, if we're not willing to put anti-racist practices in place in our organization, then we are merely papering over the cracks and doing the convenient thing instead of the thing that's actually really going to shift the system. We all have biases. I have biases. I'm intentionally doing my anti-racism work and almost every time I scratch below the surface, I see something else that that I'm absolutely ashamed of, that I've done to perpetuate and persist existing systems of pain and suffering, and I'm not prepared to do that anymore. And being able to do this work intentionally with your team and your organization is going to be, I think if we really do intend and imagine that leading together is going to shift the way that we think about work, we can't not do this work. And so I guess like how do we do this, Brent, right? So how can leaders be more intentional about ensuring that we're fostering this within our organizations?
Well, I think you've used the word intentional multiple times in the last couple of minutes, and it does start first with the leader being really clear in their own intentions, their personal intentions, and having the willingness to look in the areas where they have been unconsciously biased in the past, as we all have. It's a function of being human, and being willing to be a role model for the organization until the leader chooses to do their work. It's very they won't be successful in asking others to do theirs, is my guess. And I think it doesn't have to be big and dramatic. It is the small micro practices. And a great example of that is, as a white male being in a room, it tends to be pretty easy for me to speak up. And I can go in with an intention of, and a knowledge of that fact, and choose my language to say, you know what, I think I've spoken enough. I'd really like to hear from, Susan, from other individuals that are in the room that maybe don't speak up as much for whatever reason, and creating space for those individuals, creating that space up front, and not filling the room. And often I'll hear people say, you know what, I'm known to talk a lot, and then they'll continue to go on and talk a lot, rather than being able to say, you know what, I'm known to talk a lot. Today I'm going to choose to listen. That took 10 seconds to say, but the impact that little micro practice can have in a room is pretty dramatic. So I think for leaders, just being clear, what is the intention, and then finding small ways that they can model that intention in their organizations. And maybe one more topic we can dive into here quickly is the, when it comes to taking the topic of diversity and inclusion into the recruiting space. And so, Travis, I know we looked at a couple of organizations in the book around recruiting. What are some things worth highlighting there?
Thanks, Brent. The interesting thing on the recruiting process is oftentimes when we're thinking about the recruiting and diversity, and even the things we've been talking about in this conversation so far, we've only been talking about the demographic recruiting, like gender and race, maybe sexual orientation, which is really just the tip of the diversity iceberg. There's so many other things, many of which is not visible to diversity, right? On introvert or extrovert, or preferred work style, work from home, or working in a group, whatever it might be. And all of that comes back to the recruiting process. And where do you start? So what are you looking for? What might be interesting? And so one powerful thing that can be helpful is saying, what would be an intriguing difference, and start to ask what would be a cultural contribution that somebody might be able to bring to the table, versus just, are they a culture fit? Because that culture fit is often an insidious way of saying, are they like me? Or is it somebody that I'd want to go hang out with or grab a beer with? And so, the best companies are looking for that cultural contribution. Or Buffer did a very intentional piece where they actually looked at the language on the early stage of the recruiting process and realized that they were using a lot of words like, oh, we want a rock star or a ninja. And those happen to be words that men resonated with a lot more strongly than women. So they were getting a lot more men coming into their pipeline, and they wanted to have a little bit more representation so they could get more quality people. And so they went, and there's actually some great tools online that you can actually put your job listing through, and it'll tell you whether or not it's gendered one way or another, or what sort of people might be interested and intrigued by that listing. Small thing you can do that can open it up and just show that you care and you're thinking about it. And as with many things, a little bit of attention goes a long way. So just being able to keep track of things in your system, even if it's just the visible forms of diversity, can start people on the road so that it's thinking about, so that the conversations start to happen more regularly.